After midnight on July 4th, 1954, a 3-year-old girl named Cher Jo Horton disappeared out of the Lackland Air Force Base area in San Antonio, Texas. Her parents had left her to play with her brother in a parking lot outside of a bar while they were inside having a drink. And when they noticed that she was missing, they formed a search party, and within an hour they had found her underwear hanging from a car door. And soon after that, people noticed a man wandering out of the darkness from a gravel pit nearby. The man was shirtless and covered in blood and scratches, and bystanders described him as dazed and in a trance-like state. He made no attempt to escape, and he just seemed super confused and was asking everyone, "What's going on here?" Meanwhile, the search party found Horton's body further down in the gravel pit, and I will spare you the details here, but I'll just say that this poor little girl had been viciously attacked. The man turned out to be a 29-year-old Air Force airman named Jimmy Shaver, who was stationed at Lackland. Jimmy was a family man with no criminal history or history of violence, and before the police could take him to jail, a constable arrived from another precinct with military orders to take him into custody. Air Force marshals interrogated him into the morning, and one of the marshals who talked to him later said that he was, quote, not normal. He was very composed, which I did not expect him to be under these circumstances. And when his wife came to visit him later in the morning, he didn't even recognize her. Jimmy was adamant that another man was responsible, and he could vaguely summon an image in his mind of a stranger with blonde hair and tattoos, but other than that, he had absolutely no memory of what had happened that night. So they asked the senior psychologist at Lackland, a man named Jollyon West, to evaluate Jimmy and see if he could help him recall what had happened. And this is where the story gets even more mysterious, because Dr. Jollyon West, whose friends called him Jolly for short, was a world-renowned expert in hypnosis and a self-described brainwashing expert. He gave Jimmy a shot of sodium pentanol, also known as truth serum, and hypnotized him. And with that, he was able to conjure up Jimmy's memories from that night, and Jimmy ended up confessing to the murder. Jimmy said that he had started drinking at home alone that night when he had visions of God, who whispered into his ear to seek and kill his cousin Beth Rainboat, who he said had sexually abused him as a child. So then he went out to the bar with a friend, and then when he saw Cher in the parking lot there, it had triggered these repressed memories for him. West later testified for Jimmy's defense, saying that it looked like he had suffered a bout of temporary insanity, but still a reporter described him as looking like he was in a trance in the courtroom. He never got up to stretch or smoke, even though he was a known chain smoker. And in the end, Jimmy was sentenced to the electric chair. As it turns out, Jimmy had actually been meeting with West for years, even before this incident had occurred, because he had been having horrible migraines that were apparently so bad that he would have to dunk his head in a bucket of ice water. The Air Force recommended him for a 2-year experimental program to treat his migraines, and it's not known what this treatment consisted of, because for some reason his specific files disappeared and no one else's did. But what we do know is that West had a very colorful past of allegedly using drugs and hypnosis to conduct behavioral control experiments on Americans without their knowledge or consent. He was probably most well known as the guy who killed an elephant by injecting it with 28,000 milligrams of LSD, just to see what would happen, and the elephant immediately had a seizure and fell on the ground dead. West's life was so shrouded in conspiracy theories and mystery, it's like something out of a science fiction spy novel. Over the course of his career, he crossed paths with some of the most controversial events of the 20th century, including the John F. Kennedy assassination, the Patty Hearst kidnapping case, and the infamous cult leader Charles Manson. More on these later. Throughout the 70s, journalists repeatedly linked him to the CIA's top secret mind control program, codenamed MK Ultra, but he adamantly denied these allegations until his death in 1999, and he would go absolutely DEFCON 5 in court on anyone who suggested otherwise. MK Ultra was a top secret CIA program from the 60s and 70s with several objectives, like being able to implant false memories into people's heads, induce specific psychological disorders, and even to create hypno-programmed assassins who would kill on command without remembering what they had done. And I know this all sounds like science fiction, but it is actually documented, and there are very well documented cases of them doing extremely unethical experiments like this on unwitting human subjects, often prisoners and people in the military. So is it possible that Jimmy Shaver's case was actually an MK Ultra experiment gone wrong? Or maybe even an MK Ultra experiment gone right? If Jimmy Shaver's case was the only strange episode in Jolly West's career, then it probably could be dismissed as just some bizarre one-off experience, but it wasn't. As it turns out, this kind of thing was actually pretty much just another day in the life for him. At 12:30 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot in his motorcade as it passed through Dealey Plaza in Dallas. And if you don't live under a rock, then you've definitely heard about this case and all the blatant red flags with the government's official narrative around it, that it was just some lone crazy gunman, and there's nothing more to it than that. But that's for another video. What I want to talk about here is what happened afterward. So here's the facts. 45 minutes after the shooting, a Dallas County police officer stopped a man named Lee Harvey Oswald in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas, about 4 miles away from where Kennedy was shot. It's not known why the officer stopped Oswald, because Oswald shot him multiple times and then ran and hid in a movie theater nearby, which was then surrounded by police, and Oswald was subsequently arrested for the murder of the police officer and the murder of John F. Kennedy. 2 days later, Oswald was being transported from the Dallas County Police Headquarters into an armored vehicle which would take him to the county jail, when out of nowhere a man stepped out from the crowd that had gathered to watch this procession and shot Oswald point blank in the chest with a .38 caliber revolver. Oswald was rushed to the hospital and died 1 hour later. The shooter turned out to be a 52-year-old man named Jack Ruby. He was the owner of a strip club in downtown Dallas, and it later came out that he had connections to Cuban political groups and organized crime. Ruby later said that he was just standing in the crowd, and then next thing he knew, he was being pinned on the ground by police with no memory of what he had just done, and he was asking everyone, "What am I doing here? And what are you guys jumping me for?" Ruby's attorney said that he had suffered a, quote, fugue state with subsequent amnesia, and that he had a blank spot in his memory. And guess who Ruby's lawyer hired to give him a psychological evaluation before trial? Well, if it isn't our good old friend Louis Jollyon West. So on April 26, 1965, West met with Ruby alone for their psychological evaluation. And as soon as he came out of that cell, West announced to reporters that Ruby had undergone an acute psychotic break at some point in the last 48 hours, and that he was now positively insane, and that his condition appeared to be unshakable and fixed. In a sworn affidavit for court, West wrote, "Last night, the patient became convinced that all Jews were being slaughtered. This was in retaliation for him, Jack Ruby, a Jew, who was responsible for all the trouble. His delusions were apparently so real that Ruby had crawled under the table to hide from the killers, and he said he'd seen his own brother tortured horribly, mutilated, castrated, and burned in the streets outside of the jail, and that the orders for this terrible pogrom must have come from Washington." And from that day forward, every doctor that examined Ruby had the same diagnosis. He was completely delusional. So now, the only known person who was still remotely connected to the John F. Kennedy assassination was completely insane and unfit to stand trial. No one knows what transpired between West and Ruby in that cell during their session, because there were no witnesses and it was not documented. But what we do know is that Ruby was totally sane when he went in there, and when he came out, he was a complete raving lunatic and was never the same again. Is it possible that West could have accepted an assignment from the CIA to scramble Jack Ruby's brains so that he was mentally unfit to stand trial and answer more questions? And is it possible that he even had the ability to do something like that if he wanted to? The answer to some of these questions would come 4 decades later in the library of UCLA. But before I get to that, there's one more case that I need to talk about. On the night of August 8th, 1969, members of a hippie cult called The Family, led by this charismatic leader named Charles Manson, went to the home of a famous movie director named Roman Polanski and his 8.5-month pregnant wife, the actress Sharon Tate. Polanski was out of town, but unfortunately Tate and 4 of her friends were home, and they were all brutally murdered in what looked like a ritualistic sacrifice. Then the next night, just 15 miles away in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, a working class couple named Leo and Rosemary LaBianca were also murdered in the same gruesome manner. And in both cases, there were extremely creepy messages written on the walls in blood, saying things like "helter skelter" and "death to pigs." At first, the police apparently had no idea who had committed these murders. Their big breakthrough, though, came in October of 1969 when Susan Atkins, a member of the Manson family, had been arrested on auto theft charges and then began bragging to her cellmates about being involved in the murders. Finally, later in the year, police connected the dots between them and arrested Manson. And Manson's motives for these murders were completely insane. He said that he was trying to start a race war with which he thought the black Americans were going to win, and then the family would go hide in the desert and then come out to rule them when the war was over, because the black Americans wouldn't be able to rule themselves. And so he wanted to frame these murders on the Black Panthers to help kick off this race war. Manson had spent most of his adult life in prison, and when he got out of Los Angeles County Prison in 1967, he immediately violated his parole by going up to San Francisco right at the height of the Summer of Love. And for some unexplained reason, his parole officer, Roger Smith, wrote a letter saying that he was doing fine, and they just transferred his parole to San Francisco, no problem. By the summer of 1968, Manson had a group of 6 or 7 girls that would follow him around in the Haight-Ashbury district, reportedly looking like they were in a trance and following his every command. They only spoke when he spoke to them, and he was banging all of them. They were his wives. That same summer, the free medical clinic on Haight-Ashbury opened up, and he would bring his girls in there for free treatment because they would get all kinds of venereal diseases and they would also get pregnant. Manson became somewhat of a character around this clinic, and Manson's parole officer also arranged for them to meet there for their weekly meetings. And I bet you can't guess who else had an office in that clinic the same summer. Jolly West. And sources that worked at that clinic say that they knew each other. That same summer, Jolly was working on an experiment that he called the Haight-Ashbury Project that was based out of this clinic, and he basically set up what he described as a laboratory disguised as a hippie crash pad in a house in Haight-Ashbury, and he got 6 or 7 grad students from UC Berkeley to grow their hair long, dress as hippies, and spend their summer trying to lure youth in there to drop acid so that they could secretly study them. Apparently this place had a reputation in the Haight, and most people knew that it was just this weird fake hippie pad, so most people would steer clear of it because it was just so obvious that something strange was going on there. So Jolly was at this free medical clinic working with these people who had contact with Manson when Manson was becoming this guru cult leader who actually had a lot of the same abilities that were the objectives of MK Ultra. This barely literate ex-con was using very similar tactics used in the MK Ultra program, like administration of LSD, sleep deprivation, and hypnosis, to persuade previously normal young people to murder complete strangers with no remorse. And there's also a ton of evidence that he was actually a CIA asset as well, like the fact that he violated his parole 6 times in 1967 and 68, and every time his parole officer would just write him a letter saying that he was doing fine and that he shouldn't go back to jail. So who was this enigmatic figure, Louis Jollyon West? Not a whole lot is known about his personal life, but from what we do know, he was born on October 6th, 1924, to a poor Russian Jewish immigrant family. He spent his upbringing between Brooklyn, New York, and Madison, Wisconsin, and he joined the Army during World War II and later became a prominent psychiatrist. A former colleague named Stephen Patel once described West as, quote, the most benevolent psychopath I've ever met. The man could charm the pants off of anyone and manipulate them into doing all sorts of things that they didn't want to do. West had spent the last couple decades of his career heading the psychiatry department at UCLA, and when he died in 1999, he left them about 200 boxes full of his research and archives for the past 20 years. 2 years later, in 2001, an investigative journalist named Tom O'Neal asked the school if he could go through them, and the school hadn't gone through them yet, so O'Neal was the first person to ever see them. He found letters between West and Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of MK Ultra, and in one of the papers he wrote, "It has been found to be feasible to take the memory of a definite event in the life of an individual and through hypnotic suggestion bring about the subsequent conscious recall to effect that this event never actually took place, but that a different fictional event did occur." And this was one of the main objectives of the MK Ultra program, and here he was saying that he had actually achieved it. After Watergate, in January of 1973, the CIA ordered all MK Ultra files to be destroyed to make sure that it never got out to the public, but in their hurry to destroy everything, they forgot about 16,000 additional papers in an offsite warehouse. The CIA conducted some horrifying experiments, like Dr. Ewan Cameron, who would hold unwilling human guinea pigs against their will, repeatedly giving them LSD and exposing them to electroshock treatments, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and playing recorded messages constantly over and over for days to try to reshape their personality. These extremely unethical experiments were all justified by the unsupported belief that the Russians were developing their own mind control techniques and that we couldn't let them beat us to it. And that's only one of the cases that we know of from the documents that the CIA forgot to burn. So that is probably just scratching the surface. The New York Times ended up getting their hands on some of these documents, and then in December of 1974 they published a front page news article about it. The government investigated MK Ultra, and after the story broke, they called a bunch of people to testify in front of Congress about it. The CIA denied that they had actually achieved their objectives of creating programmed assassins and stuff like that, and they basically just claimed that the whole project was a colossal failure. I got basically all of my information for this video from chapter 11 of the book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s by Tom O'Neal. That book goes super deep, and this video is literally just about one little part of it. I also got some information from the book Poisoner in Chief by Stephen Kinzer, so definitely go check out those two books if you want to learn more about this topic. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this video. This was my first YouTube video, but I'm going to be putting out videos like this now every couple of weeks. Peace.